your message in the chat. Great to have you here, and thanks for letting us know. And just we'll at some point, maybe in the third session, Dan, we'll come back and talk about neo Hasidism because that's a more accessible uh, version, much more accessible, actually, I think, than what we're going to be mostly talking about this evening. So, well, welcome everybody. It's great to see all of you. And this session, or these three sessions, were, excuse me, originally meant to be part of the Kabbalah series last spring. I think many of you were part of that series, and this is one way of thinking about Hasidic Judaism is that it was, one of the more recent expressions of the Jewish mystical tradition. I thought it would be worth briefly just kind of reviewing the three main phases of Jewish mysticism before we turn to Hasidism in particular, and also the other piece. There's a bridge piece that I don't think we talked very much about last spring, which is the movement that was started by the false messiah Shabtai Tzvi. So we're going to talk a little bit about that as a bridge from the more traditional Kabbalistic approach to the Hasidic approach. So, all right. So again, just by way of review, both for people who weren't here last spring and also just to remind us all of what the larger context is. So this first notion that the Jewish mystical tradition is broadly understood to contain three distinctive strands. There's the theosophical strand, which is really focused on a theoretical understanding of the dynamics of the hidden spiritual world, and also possibly the ability to influence those dynamics once you understand them. So that's the theosophical piece. There's ecstatic Jewish mysticism, which is really focused, ecstatic or prophetic Jewish mysticism, which is focused on the ability to personally experience and or interact with elements or entities from the hidden spiritual world and acquire knowledge about the material world or universe, which is generally unavailable to other human beings by way of this personal experience. And then the third strand is the practical or magical strand of Jewish mysticism. And this focuses on the ability to use esoteric knowledge to influence specific human situations, such as those related to health or professional success or interpersonal relationships, etc., etc. So, and this magical practical has traditionally been kind of frowned upon by the people who consider themselves pure Kabbalists. And they say, those people who dabble in the magical stuff are, they're at a lower level. So those are the three main strands. And then each of those three strands appear in different ways at each level of the development of the Jewish mystical tradition. So the first level comes from, I'm sure there was Jewish mysticism in the biblical period proper, but it really gets started, it really gets written about initially by the early rabbis in the Mishnah a couple thousand years ago, and they refer back to two biblical chapters. Chapter 1 of Genesis and chapter 1 of the book of Ezekiel are kind of the primary source texts for the early rabbinic mystics. And most of these people are either of the theosophical bent, where they're using these texts to learn about the secret structure of the spiritual world. And then a few of them are also on the ecstatic end, and these are the people who are who are called those who descend into the chariot, the Yordei Merkava, and they are meditators, and they are seeking out a direct personal experience of these hidden dimensions. In this phase of Jewish mysticism, in the early rabbinic phase, the spiritual world and the material world are seen as being quite distinct from each other, and mostly, and the spiritual world is transcendent in relationship to the material world. So it's not a boundary that's easily crossed. I think, if you're a spiritual entity, you can cross that boundary more easily. But if you're a human being, it's quite difficult. But the boundary is quite thick. I think that's the main point here, is that these worlds are really, very, very different places and inhabited by very different kinds of beings. So that is level 1, and that is pre-Kabbalistic, in the strict sense of the term, pre-Kabbalistic Jewish mysticism. So Kabbalah proper comes on the scene about 1,000 years later, a little bit more than that, maybe in the 12th century in southern France and Spain, and this phase is culminated with the appearance of the book called the Zohar, which is came to be seen as the third holiest book in Jewish tradition after the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, and the Talmud. And the Zohar appears in the late 13th century. So this is about a 100-year period from the late 12th to the late 13th century. And in this phase of the Jewish mystical tradition, the emphasis is primarily on the theosophical strand of things. The Zohar really comes to talk mostly about the structure of the hidden spiritual dimensions of the universe. And the Zohar also really brings into focus this notion of the Sfirot, these divine emanations. Prior to the Zohar, they were seen as divine tools that God used to create the universe. But by the time of the Zohar, these are actually part of divinity proper, emanated from divinity. And, again, we're not going to go into detail at this point. The tree of life, starting at the top with the Sphira of Keter, Chokhmah and Bina, wisdom and understanding. And there's also another dimension to the divine that these early Kabbalists talk about, which is Ein Sof, which means eternal or without end, literally. And so this dimension of the divine is completely transcendent, cannot be grasped in any way by the human mind or the human imagination. But the Sfirot, especially the 7 lower Sfirot, can be to some extent experienced by humanity. So this was a development in the world of Jewish mystical understanding. The Sfirot in some ways were quite a radical departure from traditional rabbinic understanding of God, because the rabbis talked a lot about the oneness of the divine, and here these, Spanish Kabbalists come along and say, well, there are actually 10 distinctive dimensions of divinity. So, I've heard people in the Jewish community talk about how confusing it is when Christians talk about the Trinity and the 3 in 1. Well, we have 10 in 1 in the mystical tradition. So that's just something to keep in mind. So another expression of another idea that comes along with this level of Kabbalah is the notion that creation takes place on 2 levels simultaneously. The the upper world, the spiritual world, and the material world are created at the same time, and the two worlds are intimately connected with each other. This is a new idea with Kabbalah proper, where it's not just that you can go to the spiritual world, but actually what happens in the spiritual world impacts on the material world and vice versa. This interdependence, this interconnectivity is a new development. Let me see. And everything in the lower world, in the material world, has some connection to divine vitality. Again, it's a closer relationship between the two worlds. And the 10 Sfirot are a bridge from Ein Sof, from the completely transcendent version of divinity, to the absolute level of material reality. In this phase, as was true in the earlier rabbinic phase, mysticism is still very much seen as an activity for the elite, the spiritual elite. This is not something, don't try this at home, right? This is not something that the masses, that it's safe to share with the masses, because this is playing with fire, and you don't want people, mostly you don't want people to get hurt. And we did, and that was true too in the early rabbinic period. And when we did the series last spring, we did talk a little bit about that famous story about the 4 rabbis who enter into the mystical orchard, and only Rabbi Akiva of the 4 of them emerges unscathed from that experience. Okay, so that is the early Kabbalah, including the Zohar. So then we move on to Kabbalah 2.0, which is the version of Kabbalah that is developed in the holy city of Tzfat or Safed in the 16th century. And this burst of spiritual creativity was generated by the expulsion of Jews from Spain and Portugal. The Spanish and Portuguese Jewish communities were incredibly, rich and creative and generative. And so when the Inquisition reached its full force, and many, hundreds of thousands of Jews ended up leaving from the Iberian Peninsula, they went, there were a few places that they went. They went to North Africa, they went to Italy, and they settled in the Ottoman Empire in Turkey. And about 2 decades after all of these Sephardic Jews settled in the Ottoman Empire won a big in a battle with one of the other Middle Eastern empires. They took over a lot of new territory, and that territory included what was the land of Israel. And so the northern city of Tzfat became this just hub of spiritual, of mystical creativity. It was economically a very desirable place to go, and it already had a reputation from the rabbinic period as being one of the 4 holy cities in the land of Israel, and so people really gravitated to Tzfat. And between the years of 1530 and 1590, Tzfat really became the global center of Jewish spiritual life. And lots of really famous rabbis developed their reputations with the teaching they did in this community. Moses Cordovero, Joseph Caro, Shlomo Alkabetz, Chaim Vital, and most of all, Isaac Luria, who for whom Lurianic Kabbalah is named, and he was the initiator of this Kabbalah 2.0. Also, many of the rituals that we engage in today were created in the context of this community. We just did Tu B'Shvat Seder. That is a creation of the Sfat mystics, Tu B'Shvat Seder. The Kabbalat Shabbat service on Friday night is a creation of the Sfat mystics. The all-night study session on Shavuot is a creation of the Sfat mystics. So all of these rituals come out of this Sfat context. I want to say so one other thing that was going on as all these Sephardic Jews were moving to Tzfat is that there was a lot of speculation after the expulsion from Spain that what the Jews were experiencing was people were understanding as something that was called the birth pangs of the Messiah. They thought, these terrible things are happening. Jewish tradition, the Messianic tradition, had this idea that before the Messiah comes, things are going to get really, really difficult. So a lot of Jewish teachers were putting out there, well, maybe we're living in this end time, and the Messiah maybe is right around the corner. But there's only so long that you can push that narrative and not have it happen before people get a little bit, disappointed. So really, by the time that Tzfat really gets off the ground, most of the Jewish world in 1530, most of the Jewish world has given up on this idea, at least for the moment, that they were living in the times immediately preceding the arrival of the Messiah. And but the mystics of Tzfat, they kind of inverted the equation, and they said, well, if it's not the birth pangs of the Messiah, we know from Kabbalah that what happens in the lower world is a mirror of what's happening in the upper world. So maybe what we are going through as a Jewish people is a reflection, excuse me, of distress that's happening in the upper world, that's happening inside of divinity. And so what we need to do, we, the mystics of Tzfat, who really understand how these worlds are interdependent, we have to try really, really hard to live the holiest way that we know how, and maybe we'll bring some healing in that way to what we're sure is something really difficult going on in the upper world, within the Sfirot, within the world of divinity. So they saw themselves as spiritual activists, and everything that they did, every ritual that they did, Isaac Luria created all these kavanot. The whole idea of a kavanah in prayer was really developed by Isaac Luria, although he used that word in a different way than how we use it. But he actually had specific mystical kavanot that were supposed to be recited alongside each prayer that were aimed at, different levels of the Sephirotic tree. And so the mystics really felt an obligation to bring as much of those kavanot into their, not just their prayer lives, but their ritual lives more generally. And when they did a mitzvah of any kind, even if it was an ethical mitzvah, there were kavanot that you could accompany that action with, that was supposed to help bring positive energy to the upper worlds. And it was also possible for non-elite spiritual practitioners to participate in this process, because every person, maybe every Jewish person, it's not totally clear to me, but certainly everybody in the Jewish community had the potential to contribute to the healing of the Shekhinah, the healing of the the lower seven sfirot. But the people who really understood, the scholars and the most highly developed mystics, they had more that they could offer, but even your person in the street could help out a little bit too. And what they believed is that if they continued to bring this positive spiritual energy in everything, to every aspect of their lives, that eventually redemption could be brought to the upper worlds, and similarly redemption would be brought to the lower world. So this is the first time in Lurianic Kabbalah that this idea that human beings actually had the power to impact on bringing redemption closer to being a reality. That was one of the new ideas in Lurianic Kabbalah, and that's important because it comes into play with Shabtai Tzvi, and we'll talk about, all right, and that's coming up real quick. So so the Tzfat stage of Kabbalah represents the full integration of a proactive messianic vision and a mystical understanding. By practicing mystical Judaism, you can have a role in helping to bring about the redemption of the universe and the redemption of the divine. But at that point, in the midst of the Tzfat, the Tzfat phase of things, I think it was clear to them that they still had a long way to go. I don't think they thought they were right on the verge of, having the Messiah and redemption arrive, because they could see that the world was still in upheaval. So, Isaac Luria, the age of Tzfat runs from 1530 to 1590. Isaac Luria arrives in Tzfat in 1570. He becomes the leader of the community immediately. And then by 1572, he actually passes away at a very young age. He's 38 at that point, or maybe 40. But so 1590, the age of Tzfat starts to, it starts to have less of an impact, at least in the local sense. But the ripple effects of the Kabbalah 2.0 go out from Tzfat, and they spread all over the Jewish world. During the 17th century, basically mainstream Judaism was Kabbalistic Judaism as it was understood by the mystics of Tzfat. It was the most dominant form of Judaism around the Jewish world. And one of the things that continued to happen is that people kept speculating about, well, maybe we're getting closer to the Messianic era. Maybe there's maybe the Messiah is actually gonna be here pretty soon. And there were different years that were thrown around as possible arrival times with Messiah. One of them, and they were based on Kabbalistic interpretations of Kabbalistic texts. And one of those years was 1648. 1648 turns out to be the year, and I'm going to butcher this word, the Chmielnicki massacres in Poland. What we know today as Ukraine was a region of the Polish kingdom or the Polish Empire. And in this region, as in other parts of Europe, many Jewish people had been recruited by the royalty of that region to basically be tax collectors on their behalf. And the Polish Ukrainian farmers and peasants had really, really horrible lives. And so, and this is not the only time it happened, but it happened in a big way in this particular moment, where there was a rebellion led by a guy named Bogdan Khmelnytsky. That's why it's, and there's a historical dispute about how many Jewish people were killed, but it runs anywhere from, the tens of thousands to the hundreds of thousands. So it was a huge loss of life, and a lot of the rage of the peasantry was directed at the Jewish community because they were perceived as being, the oppressors, because they were the ones who were the tax collectors on behalf of the people that were high, the actual royalty proper. So instead of the Messiah coming, this terrible catastrophe took place, and it took place in Poland, but news of it spread throughout the Jewish world as well. So there was a lot of many people in many parts of the Jewish world were, completely devastated by what was happening, and in a similar way to the way that the expulsion from Spain had devastated the entire Jewish world. And so there was so much devastation that a council of rabbis prohibited all kinds of celebrations within the Jewish community, including limiting what could happen at a wedding, and there was no public celebration of any kind because of the terrible massacre that had happened. So that was 1648. Now, another thing that happened in 1648 was this young man, Shabtai Tzvi, who had grown up studying the Kabbalah of Isaac Luria. He came to believe that he was the Messiah. And he started proclaiming himself the Messiah. He was born and lived for the younger part of his life in Smyrna in Turkey, and he was going around telling everybody in 1648 that he was actually the Messiah, and nobody paid any attention to him. They thought he was a poor, misguided. He actually was an ordained rabbi. He had had like a basic rabbinic education, and he had studied Kabbalah as well. But people didn't think very much of what was going on. But he continued to proclaim himself in this way, and he started to behave in ways that he felt embodied what it meant to be the Messiah. Like one of the teachings in the Talmud about the Messianic period is that all of Jewish law will no longer apply when the Messiah gets here. So he would do things that, demonstrated that he thought Jewish law didn't apply in the same way. One thing he would do is he would go around and recite the secret name of God out loud, the Yud He Vav He Tetragrammaton. He would pronounce it, and no one had done that for 2 millennia. But that was one of the things he did, and he taught that all the fast days should be celebrated as feast days. And he kept getting kicked out. He got kicked out of Smyrna, and he went to Constantinople. He got kicked out of Constantinople eventually, and he went to Cairo. He got kicked out of Cairo. He went to Jerusalem. And everywhere he went, the more traditional rabbis said, this guy is trouble. We don't want him in our community. And but then he hooked up with, by this time he was almost 40. It was in the 1660s. And he met this younger man who was named Nathan, who lived in Gaza of all places. And Nathan felt that Nathan was actually had prophetic abilities, and he had prophetic dreams in which he saw himself meeting someone who was going to be the Messiah. And so when Shabtai Tzvi showed up, Nathan said, you are, Nathan totally supported this idea that Shabtai Tzvi had, that he was the Messiah. And so then things started to turn around for Shabtai Tzvi. And with Nathan's support, he started getting more support from some of these communities and some of these other rabbis. And well, let me, you know what, I'm throwing a lot of stuff out at you guys at one time. Let me stop. Let me just stop. Let me make sure that at least the different phases of the mystical tradition, and we are going to get to Hasidut tonight, I promise, but I just wanted to lay out, the pre-Kabbalistic version, Kabbalah 1.0, Kabbalah 2.0, and then this bridge that is formed by, we can't really understand Hasidic Judaism unless we understand how earlier versions of Kabbalah led to the Shabtai Tzvi situation, which turned into a disaster for the Jewish community. So that's why we're spending a little bit of time on this.
I agree with your approach. I mean, you obviously know more than I do, but I know enough. And to say that I know what's coming down the road for our friend Shabbatai and the devastation it unleashed among world Jewry, and I agree with you. You can't explain how Hasidism is able to come into the space that it does without the devastation caused by the end of Shabbatai's story.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments at this point before we'll do a little bit more on Shabtai Tzvi, and then that'll lead us. Maxine.
Where did the name Zohar, what does that mean?
It means brightness in Hebrew, and a lot of the mystical books were given names that had to do with light, not surprisingly, I think, because in lots of mystical traditions, light is a metaphor for, we even say, right? We say enlightenment, and so the Zohar, there was another book called the Bahir, which also is another word that has to do with light and brightness. So, so it's a book that was supposed to bring clarity and lucidity to our understanding of the world. Thanks for that question. Any other questions at this point? Okay. All right. So, Shabtai Tzvi, so he's picking up support, and eventually gets enough support that he returns to his hometown of Smyrna, where he'd been kicked out 20 years earlier, but he's got so much energy behind him that he actually becomes the Jewish leader of Smyrna at that point. And the head rabbi of the town, of the city, who is still suspicious of him and critical of him, basically, Shabtai Tzvi has the power at that point to kick this guy out and to install his own supporter as the new chief rabbi of Smyrna. So that happens in 1665. And again, Smyrna's in Turkey. So so his prophet Nathan has been, one of the things that Nathan talked about was the idea that Shabtai Tzvi was going to not just, become the most important Jewish ruler, but that he was going to be given power in the non-Jewish world too. And they're in the Ottoman Empire, and so they decide they're going to go to back to Constantinople. And the story was that when they get there, that the vizier of the Ottoman Empire would voluntarily, give his power over to Shabtai Tzvi. So there's this entourage that goes from Smyrna to Constantinople, and the vizier is given a tip-off by someone that Shabtai Tzvi is on the way, and he's told what Shabtai Tzvi is hoping to have happen. And the vizier and his army meet Shabtai Tzvi at the border. And instead of offering Shabtai Tzvi his royal, crown, he arrests Shabtai Tzvi and puts him in prison. But it's a very nice prison. It's like, it's like federal prison in our context. It's a cushy kind of place. And I guess, Shabtai Tzvi has a lot of supporters who bribe the prison wardens, and he gets very good treatment. And he basically continues to teach as the Messiah from his prison cell. And the stories about him continue to be shared throughout the Jewish world. And the fact that he's been imprisoned, but he's still teaching, makes a lot of Jewish people think he really must be the Messiah. He's like, okay, he didn't get the vizier's crown, but he seems to be able to have his way in this, this most powerful empire of the day. So that goes on for a while, and then it becomes it's brought to the vizier's attention that Shabtai Tzvi is continuing to kind of teach in a way that undermines the power of the vizier. And so the vizier decides to put a stop to this, and he brings Shabtai Tzvi back to Constantinople, and he says, you have three choices. You can convert to Islam, we can impale you as an enemy of the state, or you can be tested to see if you're truly a divine, personage, and we'll have people shoot arrows at you. And if you come out of that, trial unharmed, we'll know that you're the Messiah. So Shabtai Tzvi, of course, decides to convert to Islam. And at that point, and then once he converts to Islam, then the vizier says, well, now that you're a Muslim, you can work for me. And, so he brings Shabtai Tzvi like onto his staff in some way. But a lot of the other Jewish people around the Jewish world, the conversion to Islam for many of them is really not, they don't take it well. That's not what they expected to have happen. Now, the core group of Shabtai Tzvi's supporters continue to believe that even in his conversion to Islam, he continues to be the Messiah, that he is, he converted in order to, reach deeply into the tradition of Islam and redeem the goodness that was in Islam. And so they continue to support him as the Messiah. And he pretends, to be a fully converted Muslim, but on the side, he's still teaching his kind of Jewish, very out there Messianic Torah. And eventually the vizier hears about that, and he sends Shabtai Tzvi into exile in a far corner of the empire, and 2 years later, Shabtai Tzvi dies. But people continue to believe that he's the Messiah. And the Sabbateans or Sabbatians, there are still small groups of Sabbateans that exist today in different pockets, in different parts of the world. They're a very small minority, but most of the people at that point let go of their belief in Shabtai Tzvi as the Messiah. But many of them had sold their businesses and sold their homes in preparation for relocating to the Holy Land, because they thought that's what was going to happen, that Shabtai Tzvi was going to lead all the Jews back to the land of Israel. So that didn't happen. And the Jewish world was both, his supporters were both, spiritually devastated, but they also were economically in dire straits as well. And the great scholar, modern scholar of Jewish mysticism, Gershom Scholem, argues that Shabtai Tzvi could not have come about were it not for the teachings of Lurianic Kabbalah. So Gershom Scholem draws a through line from Isaac Luria to Shabtai Tzvi, this belief that intentional, redemption-focused human behavior could lead to the rectification of the upper worlds and to the redemption of the lower worlds. That's a Lurianic idea, and that is the idea that Shabtai Tzvi and his prophet Nathan latched onto. And with the demise of Shabtai Tzvi, the majority of the Jewish world became very suspicious and cautious of anyone claiming messianic status or predicting the imminent arrival of the Messiah. So we're talking about the late 1600s now, the late 17th century when he dies. The other thing that happens after his death is that pretty much almost all of the Kabbalah scholars all around the Jewish world, they back away from this idea that you can teach Kabbalah to the masses that the Lurianic system generated. They realize, or they decide, that it's, again, like the old school, they come back around to the understanding that it's dangerous to teach Kabbalah to the masses, and they just they retrench in these small, esoteric, secretive groups, and they study together, but there is a real there's a real end to the dissemination of Kabbalistic ideas out into the world more generally. Now they still are out there in some ways, because Isaac Luria published a prayer book or his disciples did, that had his special kavanot printed on the same page as the prayers, and those prayer books were available to people. So especially in the Middle Eastern Jewish communities and in the Sephardic communities, people continued to use the Lurianic prayer books for their community worship experiences. But a lot of the juice had, a lot of the air had been let out of the balloon at that point. So this is the world that Hasidic Judaism kind of comes into, with, having just come through the tragedy in the last century of the Chmielnicki massacre, followed by the tragedy of the false messiah Shabtai Tzvi. And so Rabbi Israel ben Eliezer, who's known as the Ba'al Shem Tov, is born in 1698. So maybe a decade or two after Shabtai Tzvi dies. And this title, Ba'al Shem Tov, I want to say a little bit about that. There was a category of Jews called Ba'al Shem, the masters of the name, that were kind of religious practitioners. They were like itinerant healers and wonder workers who would go from village to village, from town to town, and they would write amulets, and they would heal people, and they knew about herbs, and some of them were said to have these kinds of really superhuman spiritual abilities to predict the future, or to disappear from one location and reappear at another location far away. So there were lots of people, or at least, I don't know if lots, but they were not rare, these Ba'al Shem that were running around Eastern Europe. But the Ba'al Shem Tov, so he started out as one of this group of a, kind of a garden variety Ba'al Shem. And he had studied with a couple of these other practitioners as a young man. And so he's born in 1698, and then he becomes a school teacher, but he also spends a lot of time in the woods by himself. and he develops his spiritual life in that way, kind of communing with nature and communing with the divine in the context of these natural surroundings. And by the time he's around 40 years old, 1738, 1740, he now has a sense of himself as a person who is spiritually at the next level beyond kind of a normal Ba'al Shem. And so he starts to introduce himself to the community. And this is in the Ukrainian part of Poland where this is happening. This is so he introduces himself to his local community as the Ba'al Shem Tov, and that he has, and he starts to do teaching on a higher level, and he reaches out to his fellow spiritual leaders and engages with them. And a lot of them are impressed with him. And they, if they don't become his disciples, they at least want to come learn, study with him. And he gathers around him a group of rabbis, mostly rabbis who are, have a traditional rabbinic training, but they see that the Ba'al Shem Tov is bringing kind of a different energy and a different perspective to Jewish life. And so he creates this group. It's initially a very small group, and but it's a group with a growing influence, both in the local and the regional sense. And in 1760, the Ba'al Shem Tov dies, and one of his disciples, who is Rabbi Dov Bear, the Maggid of Mezeritch, becomes the new leader of what is the nascent kind of Hasidic movement at that point. And the Maggid of Mezeritch has an institutional sensibility and an organizing capacity that the Ba'al Shem Tov did not possess. And so what the Maggid of Mezeritch starts to do is he starts to build a movement that's much larger. And he gathers around him a group of young and dynamic and charismatic rabbis who are very excited about this new vision of Jewish life. And what eventually happens is that each of these young rabbis that come to study with the Maggid of Mezeritch go off and found their own Hasidic community in different parts of Eastern Europe. And one of these young dynamic teachers happened to be a man, rabbi named Shneur Zalman of Liadi, who was the founder of Chabad. He became the founder of Chabad coming out of this kind of hothouse, spiritual hothouse of the circle of the Maggid of Mezeritch. And there were a number of other very famous Hasidic Rebbes that come out of this circle as well. It's the Maggid really is seen as the person who creates Hasidic Judaism as a movement. Now, I'll just say, so far, let me stop for a sec. Does questions or comments about at this point, if at the very beginning of Hasidic, the development of Hasidic Judaism? Okay. All right. Well, just stop me, raise your hand if a question occurs to you. But I just want to point out that, oh yeah, Alan, yeah, go ahead.
Were there any new texts that arose at this time that they used to, promote this new perspective or, engage people in their new ideas?
That is a great question. So at the first couple of generations of Hasidic leaders, as is true of a lot of new movements, a lot of their teachings were oral. So neither the Ba'al Shem Tov nor the Maggid eventually does put down some aphorisms in a book, or he starts to do that and it's finished by his disciples. But a lot of the Hasidic writings appear after the generation of the Maggid, and his disciples are the ones who put that stuff in writing. And then a lot of these people in the circle of the Maggid who go off and found their own communities, many of them write their own books, like Shneur Zalman, who wrote the Tanya. So he wrote this very sophisticated, book of in that context, modern Kabbalah, based on his learning in the circle of the Maggid. And then a lot of the other Rebbes also wrote books of their own at that point. But that's really the generation that started writing, is the third generation after the Ba'al Shem. Thank you. Bruce?
I'm not quite getting the connection between the collapse of the Sabbatai Tzvi movement and the founding of Hasidism. Is the idea that the Sabbatai Tzvi thing put an end to sort of the popularity of Lurianic Kabbalah, and that left an, if you will, an opening for this Hasidic version of things to come in? Or is it that it led to a widespread disillusionment that left again a sort of a gap that the Ba'al Shem Tov could fill? If you can make that connection more explicit.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Bruce. Yes, absolutely. That the disillusionment in the wake of the failure of Shabtai Tzvi, and then the pulling back of the really so many of the mystical teachers, around in very many different Jewish communities. So there was simultaneously this sense of disillusionment, and then a kind of a cutting off of spiritual nourishment at the same time, out of fear for what that nourishment might generate. So yes, it left a void that I think the Ba'al Shem Tov saw and experienced and felt compelled to address. Is that helpful?
Yes, very. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for that question. So, I do want to emphasize, though, that the worry among the Jewish leaders, the mainstream Jewish leaders, about kind of new movements in Judaism had not gone away, in the last several generations. So as Hasidism is ramping up in its energy, there's a lot of concern among more traditional, or more, let's call them mainstream Jewish teachers and leaders, and they worry that, is this some kind of new version of Sabbatianism, and as I said, there were still pockets of followers of Shabtai Tzvi that continued to exist, and the traditional rabbis knew about that, and there were famous disputes between rabbis where one rabbi would accuse another rabbi of being a closet follower of Shabtai Tzvi. And then the second rabbi would be forced to defend himself. So that dynamic was very much in operation as Hasidism was kind of coming onto the scene. So the Steve Bass, yeah.
Very, very basic question. Shabtai Tzvi. What is the message that the Messiah would give to his disciples or the people to identify him as a Messiah? What is the message? And maybe that message was then taken over by the Ba'al Shem Tov. I don't know, but is there something special about a messianic message?
And Steve, do you mean how would he prove that he was the Messiah to people, or what would the Messiah, what would you expect the Messiah to actually come and proclaim if someone were claiming that role?
Yes, both of those.
Okay. Yeah. So there were different understandings of what the Messiah would do and could do. One of those main understandings with the Messiah would be a kind of a spiritual superhuman who'd be able to really perform miracles. And what's interesting is that Shabtai Tzvi's prophet Nathan, as he disseminated, this good news about the arrival of the Messiah, a lot of his communications included an exhortation to the people that they rely on their faith rather than relying on the miracles that Shabtai Tzvi would perform. So that's kind of interesting that Nathan the prophet seemed like he was kind of proactively trying to keep people from needing to have a miracle as proof that he was the Messiah. Now, in terms of what he was proclaiming, the traditional understanding of the Messiah is that he would restart the Jewish commonwealth in the land of Israel. And some of the messianic prophecies were much broader than that, and that basically the whole world would be transformed as a result, and the whole world would have the capacity to live in peace in a way that it hadn't before. And a lot of these biblical prophecies of peace in the world, and even like animals that normally were enemy, lion and the lamb lying down with each other, that even the nature of the physical universe would be transformed. So, but at the very least, the Messiah is the literal meaning of Messiah is the anointed one. And you are anointed most of the time to be the king. So the Messiah would be the new Jewish king in the land of Israel, and he was supposed to bring back the lost 10 tribes and reconstitute the Jewish commonwealth there, and all the Jews from the diaspora would come and join him and be a part of the Jewish kingdom in the land of Israel. So that is a big piece of the messianic message. Is that helpful? Okay. Okay. All right. Anyway, thank you for that question, Steve. So, okay. So jumping back into kind of like the early development of Hasidic Judaism. So what the Ba'al Shem Tov saw in his surroundings, he saw a Jewish community where the typical spiritual leadership in the Jewish community was based on the mastery of halakha, the mastery of Jewish law. And if you studied enough Talmud, you were a rabbi, and you worked your way up, and you became a spiritual leader of the community. And the other thing that made someone a civic leader of the community was just personal wealth. And so those were the two ways that people could kind of become leaders of the of the Jewish community. And the Ba'al Shem Tov really, his mission was to energize the masses of poor Jews that he saw as suffering, spiritually suffering and physically suffering. And so he was trying to come up with a form of Judaism that would be accessible and also nourishing, spiritually nourishing to these the non-elite of the Jewish world in Eastern Europe. So not only did he push back against kind of the model of being the Talmud scholar, but he also pushed back against the Kabbalistic model of the Kabbalistic scholar in the traditional Lurianic vein, who knew the ins and outs of the Sephirotic tree and knew all the kavanot. And the Ba'al Shem Tov did not seem to feel that model, and I think he had good reason to believe this, was going to be workable for the Jewish masses. So he de-emphasized all of these things as being important in Jewish spiritual life. And he replaced them, or he moved to the fore, some other core values. One core value was this idea of dveikut, of clinging or cleaving to the divine that is always present in every situation and at every moment. He brought to the fore some teachings that were originally appeared in the Talmud, but then were, brought down in Kabbalah, but were never kind of put at the center in the way that he put them at the center. And one of those teachings is actually something that we recite either weekly or daily, depending on how often in the traditional Jewish liturgy, in the Kedusha, but we say, Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tsevaot, Malo Kol Haaretz Kavodo. Either the whole earth is full of divine glory, or the fullness of the earth, of the material world, is in fact what is the divine glory. Either of those two translations. But either way, this idea that divinity is fully present and represented in the material world. It's not about the divinity being transcendent. It's not even about the two worlds being interconnected. It's even closer than that. It's more than that. It's like divinity is fully inhabiting, that the physical world is fully saturated with divinity. And so that was one of the core teachings that he brought. He also, the role of prayer versus Talmud study. In the more traditional Jewish world, Talmud study was actually clearly more important. I mean, people prayed, but they did it often in a perfunctory kind of way. For the Ba'al Shem Tov and his Hasidic followers, prayer really moved to the center of ritual life. And prayer was an opportunity to really feel that connection to divinity that's present all the time, but that we often are so distracted that we're not aware of. So prayer became very, very important. I'm guessing many of you have heard and it's not just prayer, but it's like what's in your heart also becomes very, very important, and doing things according to the exact way that the tradition requires it. Not that he doesn't totally snub that, but it's not the highest priority anymore. And the story from the children's prayer book that we use sometimes when we do Shabbat in the park, we almost always read this story. I think it's called The Scholar and the Shepherd. And in this story, the shepherd has this prayer that he recites every day. It's a simple prayer. It's not based on any particular liturgy, but he says it with all of his heart. And one day the scholar passes by and hears the shepherd reciting this prayer, and the scholar is just scandalized because the shepherd is doing it wrong. He's not using the traditional words, and he stops the shepherd. He says, listen, let me teach you how to pray. And he goes ahead and he recites, the words of the Amidah for the shepherd. And the shepherd thanks him and says, oh, thank you so much. I didn't realize I was praying in the wrong way. And then the scholar goes on his way. And the next day, the shepherd tries to pray. And you know what? He can't remember everything that the scholar told him. And he's so worried about doing it wrong that he doesn't do anything. And in the original version of the story, God and the angels, they loved the shepherd's prayer before the scholar came along because it was so offered in such a pure, wholehearted way. And now that the shepherd is no longer offering his prayer on a daily basis, God and the angels are very upset. And actually, in the original version of the story, it's kind of a dark story. I think this scholar is actually sentenced to death by the heavenly court because he has put this stumbling block in the way of this very prayerful person who now is no longer praying. Okay, I'm going to stop there, and Bruce has a question or comment.
Actually, I have two questions. One is a throwback to when you introduced the Ba'al Shem Tov.
Yeah.
So what was the Tov, the addition of Tov, supposed to do? And in particular, I always thought it modified the word Shem, so that he was master of the good name. But you're saying there were these Ba'al Shem, and so is Tov modifying Ba'al Shem to say that he's a better Ba'al Shem than the other ones. So that's the question one. Question two is, it's my impression of at least modern Hasidism is that Talmud knowledge is highly prized within that world, which does not sound like what you were just describing. So maybe I'm getting ahead of the game, ahead of the story with that. But maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah, thank you for both of those, Bruce. So I would say, and I don't know that I have a definitive answer to the addition of Tov, but yes, I would lean towards that it modifies the whole phrase, and it serves to elevate his status in comparison to the other Ba'al Shem. But that's worth looking into a little more deeply. And the contemporary Hasidic Jewry is much more oriented towards Talmud study. Things have changed a lot in 200 years. I guess that's the reality. And part of that had to do, one of the things that happened, because there was so much suspicion on the part of the traditional Jewish community, and I think many of you are familiar with this term, the mitnagdim, those who oppose the Hasidim, the opposition, but they're not the loyal opposition, they're the disloyal opposition. They thought the Hasidic movement was dangerous, and they were willing to fight, sometimes even physically, against these emerging groups, these emerging Hasidic communities. Not only did they get into physical fights with each other, but the mitnagdim, the opposition, would go to the secular Gentile authorities and try to turn those authorities against the Hasidim. They would try to leverage the power of the Polish government or the Russian government against the Hasidic communities, because they wanted those communities to be completely undermined. And so there was really a kind of war for almost a generation between the Hasidic Jews of Eastern Europe and those who oppose the Hasidic Jews, who are sometimes called the Litvaks. The opposition to Hasidism really emerged out of Lithuania, because Lithuania was the seat of the kind of the culture of Talmudic study. And so the Lithuanian, and now there were, Lithuanian influenced Jews all over Eastern Europe, but Lithuania was the heart of that part of the Jewish world. So that war went on for about a generation. And then what happened is that I think a couple things happened. One is that the Litvak Jews came to understand that the Hasidic Jews were not nearly as radical as the followers of Shabtai Tzvi, that they were halachic Jews, and the things that they were in Jewish law, the things that they were pushing the edges on were not that big a deal. And also at the same time, the energy of the modern Enlightenment was starting to make itself felt in Eastern Europe. And so these two groups, the Hasidic Jews and the non-Hasidic Jews, understood that they were both in opposition to the new secular learning, and so to the new Enlightenment, to the new Western Enlightenment. And so they joined forces against the Western Enlightenment, and I think there started to be a lot more overlap. Now there are still distinctions between Hasidic and non-Hasidic communities, but an interest in Talmud is probably not such a major distinction anymore. Not only that, but among the opposition to the Hasidim, there were some leaders who were very deeply steeped in Kabbalah. There were some like the Gaon of Vilna, who is the main leader of the anti-Hasidic group. He was a scholar of Kabbalah, but he did not agree with what the Hasidic Jews were doing, in the sense that they were, again, kind of disseminating Kabbalah in some ways to the masses, but they were also, he would probably say, watering it down, because they weren't talking so much about the Sfirot anymore. They were talking about these kind of big spiritual concepts, like the presence of the divine everywhere. There's a Talmudic phrase in Aramaic, leit atar panui mine. There is not a place that is empty of divinity. So I think, the Vilna Gaon and other Litvak leaders who knew Kabbalah didn't like this idea of this watered down, built for the masses, Kabbalistic movement going on. So that I don't know if that also, Bruce, helps a little bit to speak to the questions that you raised. So in addition to these basic ideas of clinging to divinity and the possibility of doing that under all circumstances, when you're going to the grocery store, when you're in the middle of your work day, when you're having just a friendly conversation with your neighbor, he taught that it was possible to be connected to divinity in the midst of all of those mundane activities. Mundane in quotation marks, right? Because divine is always present. The Ba'al Shem Tov and Hasidic Judaism also emphasized joy and de-emphasized asceticism. Asceticism was a very important part of the Jewish mystical tradition of Tzfat. People would fast and they would, you know, come up with all of these self, you know, these behaviors that would cause them, they would, you know, kind of test themselves and build up their ability to experience discomfort and pain, all for the purpose of, you know, repentance. And the Ba'al Shem Tov rejected that completely. And he said, no, it's about joy. It's about joy and finding joy in all aspects of life. Yeah. Someone have a question? No. Okay. And again, the prayer experience being elevated in some ways beyond the study experience, and giving yourself over to the power of prayer and the ecstasy of prayer. So one of the smaller things that was scandalous initially for the Litvak community is that sometimes in the midst of prayer, Hasidic Jews would get very physical, you know, not just shuckling back and forth, but they would, you know, they would clap their hands and they would, you know, jump in the air. And there was a story about, maybe it was about the Ba'al Shem Tov, maybe about one of his disciples, where, you know, he would start off his prayer in one corner of the room and he'd always end up in a different corner of the room because the physical energy of the prayer would move him so much. So that was seen as a little bit outlandish by the Litvak community. But the other thing that Hasidic Jews would do is they weren't as worried about, you know, traditionally Jewish law requires that each of the three prayers has to happen between certain times of day. And you can't do the prayer if you're not in the right time of day. So in the Hasidic community, if people were kind of in the middle of an ecstatic prayer experience, they just didn't worry too much about, you know, needing to end the prayer because the time for prayer was over for that particular, you know, for Mariv or for Mincha or for Shacharit. So that bothered the Litvakers a lot. And I think that to them smacked a little bit of the Shabtai Tzvi approach and the willingness to kind of go beyond Jewish law. But that was really not what the Hasidic Jews were about. They, you know, in general, respected and wanted to follow Jewish law, but sometimes they were willing to bend it in the spirit of wanting to help people connect with that direct experience of divinity in the moment. Let's see here. So the last thing I want to, so the Ba'al Shem Tov brought this. I think it's widely understood that the Maggid of Mezeritch, he kind of pushed the Ba'al Shem Tov's teaching about divinity even a little further than Ba'al Shem Tov took it. And the Maggid in some of his writings, and I think we'll look at a couple of these, you know, maybe next week, and his disciples, the step further that they went, and this is again kind of looking at the relationship between the material world and the spiritual world, or the upper world and the lower world, is they said that there is actually no difference between those two worlds. They are the exact same thing, and it is a, you know, there is a divine disguise that is part of the lower world that enables, you know, human beings, for example, to experience ourselves as individuals, but that the reality is that the divine is here in the material world as powerfully as the divine is in the upper world, and there really is no difference between them, and that and from God's point of view, if you will, you know, there is no distinction. We see a distinction, but that distinction is not actually real. So that is, there's a famous letter that was written by one, this is like the 5th or 6th generation of Hasidic leadership. And in the letter, the one disciple says to the other disciple, well, you know, they're discussing the difference between like Judaism and Christianity or something. And the one disciple says, well, you know, the difference is that we Jews have a great secret that the Christians don't have. And that secret is everything is God. That's actually, and he writes it in Yiddish. He says, "Alles is Gott." That is the quote. And now, not every Hasidic leader bought into that in the same at the same level of depth, but that is, you know, that was, you know, set up by the Ba'al Shem Tov and really developed by the Maggid and his inner circle. And certainly Chabad, if you read the Tanya, has that teaching in it as well. I'm sorry, one more thing I just want to say real quick about Hasidic Judaism. So these rabbis, these Rebbes around the table with the Maggid, they found these spiritual dynasties in these different towns all throughout Eastern Europe, and they establish this identity as the Rebbe. And the Rebbe is very different than a rabbi. The Rebbe is really like a guru. The Rebbe has that kind of stature within the Hasidic community. The Rebbe is someone who sees into the soul of all of the Hasidim that are, generally speaking, his disciples. And people go to the Rebbe to ask the Rebbe questions about, you know, any dimension of their lives. You know, doesn't have to be specifically religious, but the Rebbe is really the true source of wisdom. And so that's an interesting thing, because it was a new kind of elite that Hasidic Judaism created. And it was an elite that wanted to help the masses to connect with divinity, but they were also seen by their Hasidic disciples as having the ability to navigate. I know this is going to sound a little contradictory to what I said a little bit earlier about, you know, they were intercessors with the divine on behalf of their Hasidic followers. So the followers trusted them to do the heavy spiritual lifting on their behalf. Alan.
I was just wondering if that's where the concept of a tzaddik came from.
Yes. Because the Rebbe, tzaddik was basically a synonym for the Rebbe. So yes, that you were a tzaddik and you had Hasidim. You know, you had followers, and they were the fully righteous, spiritually evolved personalities, and they could do things. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. One last thing. So, but what this system didn't do, or what it did do, was that it made the focus all about the spiritual development of the individual, and it backed away from the spiritual development of the collective. The whole idea of collective redemption took a back seat in the Hasidic. So that's another connection to Shabtai Tzvi, because the Ba'al Shem Tov understood that the collective redemption is what took the Jewish community in a problematic direction. You could still talk about it in prayer, but not believe that you personally were actually helping to bring about the redemption. the spiritual work was about your own growth and not about bringing the Messiah. The whole idea of the Messiah took a radical backseat, and I can anticipate that some people are going to be wondering at this point, well, what about Chabad? Because today, Chabad walks around with signs that say, we want Mashiach now. And every mitzvah that they get people to do is for the purpose of bringing the Messiah closer. So we'll put that on the back on hold for one of the, for the later session. But initially, Ba'al Shem Tov, thanks, Dan. Thanks for being here. Ba'al Shem Tov really understood that the messianic piece had to be circumscribed. And he built, and he and the Maggid built a tradition that absolutely succeeded in doing that. Okay, Nancy.
This might be too big a question, but I'm wondering what was happening philosophically, politically, theologically in the rest of the world at this time. Because it sounds like that making shift from collective to individual probably was in context of what was happening globally somehow.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it is a big question, but I will just briefly say that many scholars of Hasidism say that Hasidism is a proto-modern movement, in part because of its shift to the focus on the individual and away from the collective. And there are other elements that scholars point to that they see in the Hasidic transformation, that it is a forerunner of the modern world in some ways. So I'll see if I can bring some more information about that next week.
Okay, great.
So thank you everybody for being here tonight. And next week, same time, same station, 7:30 on Thursday evening. And I'll try to get some. I apologize that I didn't get any pre-readings out this time. I'm going to try to do that for next week. So
and look for the link in the update. I can't send it out to everybody because most of you didn't sign up for it in the first place. So the link will be in the update, not sent out.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you for organizing all of this. And look forward to seeing you all soon. Okay, take care.
Thank you. This is great. Really.
Thanks, Steve. Bye.
Very interesting.